If you're new here, understand this quickly. This is not entertainment in the usual sense. You don't watch this and leave unchanged. Something shifts in how you interpret yourself afterward. If you're returning, then you already know the pattern. Clarity tends to increase here, even when it's uncomfortable. Before anything else, turn on subtitles. Not for style, for precision. Some ideas land differently when you can see them as they're spoken, not just hear them pass through you. Now stay with this. There is something most men experience in silence, yet almost no one can describe accurately without discomfort. Not because it's rare, but because it's normalized to the point of invisibility. You already know what I'm referring to, even before it is named. What starts as a private habit, something harmless, something framed as relief, escape, stress release. It doesn't announce itself as important. That is the first layer of its design. Because anything that wants control over behavior does not arrive as force. It arrives as permission, and that is where most people misread it. There is a moment every man remembers, though he rarely admits it even to himself. The first time it stopped feeling like choice and started feeling like reflex. The first time intention was present, but not in control. The body moved faster than thought. The decision was already made before awareness could intervene. And still, the mind called it normal. That's the subtle fracture point most never return to examine. Because after that moment, something quiet begins to shift. Not in a dramatic way, not in a visible collapse, but in attention itself. In how focus behaves when no one is watching. In how patience dissolves in small increments. In how reward begins to feel like something that must arrive instantly or not at all. You don't notice it as a change. You notice it as preference. But preferences can be engineered. And here is where the uncomfortable part begins. The brain is not moral. It is adaptive. It does not ask whether a stimulus is good or bad. It asks only one question. Does this produce reward with minimal resistance? If yes, it strengthens the pathway. If no, it weakens it. Over time, whatever provides the fastest emotional escape begins to feel not just attractive, but necessary. This is where the quiet transformation starts. Not in behavior first, but in tolerance. Tolerance for discomfort decreases. Tolerance for boredom collapses. Tolerance for waiting becomes fragile. Real-world stimulation starts to feel slow, almost irritating in comparison to synthetic intensity. And yet life itself does not accelerate to match internal conditioning. This mismatch creates something subtle but persistent. Restlessness. Not the kind you can easily name. The kind that sits under ordinary moments. Reading feels heavier. Focus drifts earlier. Motivation requires more negotiation than before. Even simple discipline begins to feel like resistance against something invisible. And still, nothing appears externally wrong. That is what makes it effective. Because a visible problem demands correction. An invisible one becomes personality. At this point, most people don't think in terms of cause and effect anymore. They think in identity language. I get distracted easily. I lack discipline. That's just how I am. But identity is often just repeated neurological pattern mistaken for truth. And if you've never questioned the pattern, you assume it is you. There is another layer most never reach. The impact on reward sensitivity. When the brain becomes accustomed to extreme or novel stimulation patterns, ordinary rewards begin to register differently. Real connection, achievement, progress, even ambition. They don't disappear, but they lose contrast. It's like adjusting your eyes to darkness and then trying to see detail in daylight without adaptation time. Everything feels underwhelming. And when life feels underwhelming, the mind starts searching for intensity again. Not meaning, not growth, but intensity. That search rarely leads upward. It loops. This is where behavior begins to split from intention entirely. A man can genuinely want discipline, clarity, focus, structure, and still repeatedly return to the same escape pattern that weakens all three. Not because he is weak in character, but because the reinforcement loop is stronger than his long-term narrative. This is a point most discussions avoid, because it removes the comfort of blame. It is easier to say, lack of discipline, than to understand conditioning loops that operate beneath conscious negotiation. But ignoring the mechanism does not stop the mechanism. It only ensures repetition. There is also something more subtle happening beneath awareness, perception of self in solitude. The private self begins to feel different from the public self. Not in an obvious split, but in tone. In internal posture. One version of you that is composed, controlled, forward-facing. Another that exists only when no one is watching, where impulse overrides structure. Over time, the gap between these two versions creates psychological friction. Not guilt in the traditional sense, but fragmentation. A quiet internal inconsistency that is rarely verbalized. And fragmentation always demands resolution. If it is not resolved through awareness and restructuring, it is resolved through normalization. The mind simply accepts contradiction as identity. I am disciplined in some areas, not in others. But the deeper truth is less comfortable. The system has learned when to surrender control. And what teaches surrender repeatedly is not philosophy. It is repetition. Now, before this continues further, consider something carefully. If this pattern is as subtle and as normalized as described, then the real question is not whether it exists in others. The question is how far it has already integrated into your own baseline expectations of attention, focus, and reward. Because most people are not trying to overcome something they fully see. They are trying to overcome something they partially feel but have never fully mapped. And what remains unmapped continues to govern behavior without resistance. There is a reason this subject is rarely discussed directly in terms of cognitive consequence. It forces an uncomfortable recognition that modern struggles with discipline are not purely motivational failures, but often reinforcement failures. And reinforcement does not respond to motivation. It responds to structure. Before going further, consider this as an identity checkpoint. If discipline only works when conditions are ideal, it is not yet discipline. It is temporary alignment. Real discipline begins when the reward system is no longer the primary driver of action. That transition is not automatic. It is trained. Now, here is where the direction of this conversation begins to shift. Because understanding the mechanism is only the first layer. Most people stop there, assuming awareness alone is enough to change behavior. But awareness without restructuring simply creates frustration with no exit path. And frustration, when sustained, often pushes a person back into the very loop they are trying to escape. There is a reason cycles persist even after insight. Insight does not override conditioning. It only illuminates it. And what you do with that illumination determines whether the pattern strengthens or dissolves. This is where the deeper work begins, but not all of it is visible yet. Because before transformation can happen, something else must be confronted first. The cost of continuing unchanged is rarely felt immediately. It accumulates silently, and when it becomes visible, it often feels like it appeared suddenly. But it did not. It was building in increments that were too small to register at the time. The next part will go into what that accumulation actually does to ambition, relationships, and internal drive in ways most men only recognize much later than they should. For now, stay with this question in the background as everything continues unfolding. What kind of mind is being trained when reward is always available without effort? And what happens to a life built on that conditioning over years, not days? The answer is not dramatic. It is structural, and structures, once formed, quietly determine everything that follows. What you rarely notice is that decline does not announce itself as decline. It arrives as adaptation, a slight shift in how you respond to boredom, a reduced tolerance for stillness. A quicker exit from anything that does not immediately stimulate attention. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you would report to anyone. Just a quiet recalibration of what feels acceptable to experience. And over time, that recalibration becomes your normal. This is where the deeper consequence begins to form. Because once the brain has adapted to fast, high-intensity reward patterns in private, it does not isolate that adaptation to one behavior. It spreads it across systems that were never meant to operate under that condition. Focus is one of the first to weaken. Not in the sense of complete inability, but in endurance. You can still concentrate, but only for shorter windows before something else feels more urgent. The mind begins to treat sustained attention as a cost rather than a default state. And once attention becomes costly, everything requiring it becomes negotiable. This is where ambition starts to feel different, though most misinterpret it. It is not that ambition disappears. It becomes fragmented. You still want progress. You still imagine outcomes. But execution starts to feel heavier than imagination can justify. So the mind starts substituting action with exposure. More information, more consumption, more planning, less execution, and it feels productive, because the nervous system is still engaged. But nothing is being built. There is a subtle deception here that most never identify. The feeling of engagement is not the same as the reality of progress. One stimulates the mind, the other restructures the self. And the mind prefers stimulation. At this stage, internal dialogue begins to shift as well. Not obviously, but in tone. A negotiation starts appearing before action. I'll do it later. I'm not fully ready. I need to feel more motivated. These are not random thoughts. They are delay mechanisms that emerge when immediate reward conditioning competes with delayed reward systems. And delayed reward always feels like resistance in a brain optimized for instant relief. So resistance becomes the dominant experience of anything meaningful. And meaning begins to lose authority. This is where many people begin to mislabel their state as laziness. But laziness is not the root. It is the surface expression of a system that has been trained to avoid delayed payoff structures. If you consistently choose low friction reward over high friction reward, the brain does not remain neutral. It reorganizes expectations around that pattern. And expectations quietly shape identity. This is why discipline cannot be built through intention alone. Because intention operates at the conscious level. But reinforcement operates beneath it. And what operates beneath always wins under pressure. There is another layer that becomes visible only after repetition over time. Emotional flattening. Not numbness in a dramatic sense, but reduction in emotional contrast. Things that once felt meaningful begin to feel less charged. Achievements feel shorter. Conversations feel less absorbing. Even rest feels less restorative. This is not because life changes. It is because internal reward sensitivity shifts. When baseline stimulation becomes artificially elevated in one domain, natural experiences lose comparative intensity. So the mind begins to seek variation rather than depth. And variation without depth creates restlessness. You might notice it in subtle ways. Switching between tasks without finishing them. Opening multiple tabs of thought but closing none. Starting things with intensity but losing momentum once novelty fades. And underneath all of it, a quiet dissatisfaction that is hard to locate because nothing is technically wrong. This is the most dangerous kind of psychological state. Because absence of visible failure creates the illusion of stability. But internally, coherence is weakening. And coherence is what sustains long-term identity structure. Without it, you are not building a direction. You are reacting to impulses as they arise. There is a point here that most never reach awareness of until much later. Your private habits do not remain private in their effects. They train your public self without asking permission. They shape how you respond to pressure, how you handle silence, how you manage discomfort, how quickly you abandon difficulty. So the real question is not about the behavior itself. It is about what type of person is being reinforced through repetition. Because repetition does not just form habits. It forms thresholds. Thresholds for effort. Thresholds for patience. Thresholds for discomfort. Thresholds for focus. And once thresholds lower, life does not feel harder externally. It feels heavier internally. There is also something more subtle that begins to form in perception of time. Future consequences become less emotionally present. Not because they are unknown, but because they feel less real than immediate relief. This is a shift in temporal weighting. The brain begins to assign higher value to immediate states over future states. And when that happens consistently, long-term thinking weakens not as a concept, but as an emotional driver. You can still plan, but planning loses force. It becomes abstract rather than directive. This is why change often feels difficult even when clarity exists. Clarity alone does not override weighted reward systems. At this point, a viewer often expects a simple answer. A reset, a trick, a replacement behavior. But that expectation itself is part of the same conditioning pattern. The desire for immediate solutions mirrors the same neural preference that created the instability in the first place. And that is where most cycles quietly repeat. Because understanding becomes another form of consumption unless it is converted into structure. Now, before continuing deeper, there is something important to recognize. If you are following this closely, it is not because the ideas are new. It is because they are being recognized, not learned. Recognition creates discomfort. Learning creates distance. And discomfort is usually the first signal that something is being mapped correctly. But discomfort alone is not change. It is only visibility. What matters next is what is done with visibility. And this is where most people hesitate. Because once a system is seen clearly, continuing it becomes a conscious decision rather than an unconscious loop. That shift carries weight. There is responsibility in awareness that did not exist before it. And responsibility is often where resistance increases. So before moving further into how this pattern restructures ambition, relationships, and identity at a deeper level, consider this quietly. If your attention has been repeatedly pulled toward instant relief over structured effort, then what you call lack of motivation may actually be a trained preference for low-friction reward. And preferences can be changed, but not through insight alone. They change through repeated replacement of reinforcement. The next part will go into what happens when this pattern is left unchecked long enough to shape not just behavior, but personality expression itself, and why most men only realize the cost after years of silent accumulation. For now, the system is already doing something in the background that most never observe closely enough to interrupt. It is choosing what feels easy over what builds strength. And every repetition of that choice is not neutral. It is instructional. At some point, the pattern stops feeling like something you do and starts feeling like something you are. That shift is subtle, almost unnoticeable, because nothing external changes dramatically. You still wake up, you still function, you still participate in life. But internally, the baseline structure of effort begins to reorganize itself around avoidance of strain. And once that happens long enough, personality starts absorbing it. Not in a theatrical way. In behavior selection. You stop noticing the decisions you are not making. The skipped workout becomes normal. The delayed task becomes expected. The later that never arrives becomes part of your internal vocabulary. And each repetition doesn't feel like a failure. It feels like continuity. That is where identity quietly begins to shift. Because identity is not what you claim. It is what you repeatedly permit. There is a point where ambition still exists in thought, but not in execution. You still see a version of yourself that is sharper, more disciplined, more controlled. But that version becomes increasingly distant from your daily behavior. So the mind does something it always does under contradiction. It creates separation. You are not that kind of person right now. Not as judgment, as explanation. And explanations reduce cognitive tension. But they also preserve the pattern. This is how internal fragmentation stabilizes. One self that imagines discipline. Another that avoids friction, and a growing gap between the two that is no longer alarming, just familiar. Familiarity is where most systems survive, because what is familiar rarely gets questioned deeply enough to be dismantled. At this stage, even awareness of the pattern does not automatically interrupt it. You can recognize exactly what is happening in real time and still follow it through to completion. Not because you lack intelligence, but because recognition and control operate on different layers. One observes, the other executes, and execution is driven by reinforcement history, not insight. This is where frustration often begins to appear inwardly. A quiet awareness that, I know better, but I still do it. And that sentence, repeated enough times, starts to shape self-perception in a very specific direction. It weakens trust in internal directives. Over time, you begin to discount your own intentions before you even act on them. You stop believing the initial resolve will hold. So you reduce commitment in advance. Not consciously, structurally. And that reduction itself becomes another layer of conditioning. There is also a deeper psychological effect that builds slowly under this pattern. The narrowing of effort identity. Certain domains of life still receive full attention. Work deadlines, social expectations, external accountability. But internal self-directed effort becomes inconsistent. So the mind starts dividing behavior into required and optional. And anything labeled optional becomes vulnerable to immediate reward override. This division is dangerous because it does not stay confined to one behavior type. It spreads. Gradually, more areas get reclassified as optional. Reading, training, planning, reflection, even long-term thinking begins to feel optional unless externally triggered. And when self-directed structure weakens, external structure takes over by default. That is where many people unintentionally hand control of their discipline to circumstances instead of intention. At this point, there is often a mistaken assumption that more motivation is needed. But motivation is not the missing variable. Motivation is inconsistent by design. What is missing is friction management. Because the system has learned to interpret friction as a signal to disengage rather than persist. And once that association is formed, effort becomes emotionally expensive. Not physically, emotionally. That distinction matters. Because most people can handle physical discomfort. What they avoid is the internal discomfort of resistance. The pause before action. The boredom during effort. The absence of immediate reward. The quiet stretch of time where nothing is happening except sustained attention. That space becomes intolerable, so it gets filled with distraction, with stimulation, with anything that restores immediate feedback. And this is where the cycle tightens. Because every time discomfort is avoided, the tolerance threshold lowers further. And lower tolerance means even less resistance is needed to trigger escape behavior. Over time, this creates a narrowing of what the mind is willing to endure. Not because it is incapable of endurance, but because it has been trained to exit early. And what is trained repeatedly becomes default. There is a moment most people experience but rarely interpret correctly. A sense that time is passing faster, yet nothing is accumulating internally. Days feel occupied but not built upon. Weeks feel consumed but not structured. And at the end of months, there is difficulty identifying what has actually changed in terms of personal strength or discipline. This is not a productivity issue. It is a reinforcement imbalance. High stimulation, low consolidation, experience without internal integration. And without integration, experience does not compound into identity. It dissipates. This is why effort without structure feels exhausting but not transformative. You are spending energy without building a system that stores adaptation. There is also a quiet psychological trade happening in the background. Short-term relief is purchased with long-term friction. Each time immediate escape is chosen, future effort becomes slightly heavier. Not dramatically, incrementally, but accumulation is how identity shifts occur. Not through single decisions, through weighted repetition. And at some point, the cumulative effect becomes visible in unexpected areas. Not just discipline, but confidence in action, willingness to start difficult tasks, ability to remain with discomfort without immediate exit. Even perception of personal capability begins to adjust downward. Not because capability is gone, but because it is underused. And underuse always alters perception of strength. There is a specific type of silence that develops in this state. Not external silence, internal, a reduction in self-directed ambition pressure. Not because ambition disappears, but because it becomes psychologically expensive to engage with it. So the mind lowers expectations to match output. This is how internal alignment is maintained without resolving the underlying imbalance. Expectation adjusts downward to reduce tension. And reduced expectation feels like relief. But it is also contraction. At this stage, most people don't need more information. They already have enough awareness to recognize the pattern. What is missing is not knowledge of what is happening. It is recognition of how deeply repetition has already structured response behavior. And that recognition is not comfortable. Because it implies that change will require more than intention. It will require resistance to the very system that currently feels easiest to follow. Before continuing, consider this quietly. If your default response to discomfort has been consistent avoidance for a long enough period, then what feels like normal behavior is actually a trained escape response. And trained responses do not dissolve through understanding. They dissolve through replacement under pressure. The next part will go deeper into what this pattern does to identity stability over time, and why many men eventually reach a point where they no longer feel in conflict with their habits, but simply aligned with them, even when they know the cost. That is where the real transformation challenge begins. Not in stopping the behavior, but in rebuilding the capacity to tolerate what the behavior was originally protecting you from. For now, the system continues operating in the background in the same way it always has. Quietly shaping what feels easy enough to repeat, and slowly determining what kind of person repetition is building. There is a point where conflict disappears. Not because the issue is resolved, but because the internal resistance that once questioned it has been worn down through repetition. And when that happens, something more serious replaces struggle. Acceptance. Not conscious acceptance. Structural acceptance. You stop arguing with the pattern. You stop negotiating with it. You stop even framing it as something that needs change. It becomes part of how you operate without emotional friction. And that is where most people misunderstand their own state. They think peace has been reached. But what actually happened is that tension was removed by lowering standards of response, not by strengthening control. There is a difference between being free from a habit and being adapted to it. One requires mastery, the other requires surrender over time. And surrender rarely feels like surrender while it is happening. It feels like relief. This is where identity begins to stabilize around the pattern rather than resist it. You no longer say, "I struggle with this." You start saying, internally or quietly, "This is just part of me." That sentence is more powerful than it appears. Because it finalizes behavior into identity. And once something becomes identity, it stops being treated as temporary. It becomes protected. Even when it is harmful. There is a subtle psychological mechanism here that most never examine closely. The mind prefers consistency over optimization. Inconsistent behavior creates internal tension. So over time, the brain resolves that tension not by improving behavior, but by aligning self-concept with behavior. That alignment reduces cognitive dissonance. But it also locks the pattern in place. This is how habits become personality traits. Not through intention. Through reconciliation. At this stage, external advice becomes less effective. Not because it is wrong, but because it no longer maps cleanly onto internal structure. Suggestions like, "Just stop," or "Be disciplined," assume a system that still treats behavior as separate from identity. But in this state, behavior and identity have already merged. So advice feels abstract, not applicable. And abstraction rarely changes behavior under pressure. There is another layer that becomes visible in this phase: emotional justification loops. When a pattern persists long enough, the mind begins to generate explanations that preserve self-image while maintaining the behavior. "I've had a long day. I deserve this. It doesn't really affect anything." These are not lies in the traditional sense. They are stabilization mechanisms. They reduce internal conflict so the behavior can continue without emotional cost. And anything that reduces emotional cost of repetition increases repetition itself. This is where the system becomes self-reinforcing without requiring conscious decision each time. It starts operating automatically. And automation is where control quietly transfers away from awareness. There is also a change in time perception that becomes more pronounced here. Future self begins to feel abstract. Not unreal, but emotionally distant. So consequences that belong to later lose psychological weight compared to present relief. And when future identity feels distant, present behavior becomes disproportionately powerful in decision-making. This is why long-term consequences often fail to interrupt short-term loops. It is not lack of knowledge. It is emotional distance between present self and future self. And that distance is shaped by repeated reinforcement of immediate reward structures. At this stage, even when a person tries to change, they often encounter something unexpected. Inconsistency of effort, short bursts of discipline followed by regression. This creates a specific emotional cycle. Hope followed by disappointment, followed by return to baseline behavior to reduce emotional strain. And over time, this cycle itself becomes conditioning. Effort becomes associated with emotional volatility. So stability is found not in discipline, but in repetition of familiar behavior. Even if it is limiting, there is a quiet cost accumulating underneath this pattern that is rarely recognized in real time. It is not just lost productivity. It is loss of internal trust in direction. When repeated attempts at change fail to stabilize, the mind begins to reduce investment in self-directed improvement altogether. Not consciously, gradually, you stop expecting follow-through from yourself. And once expectation lowers, effort becomes less frequent. Because expectation is what fuels initiation. Without it, action requires constant negotiation. And negotiation exhausts intent. There is also something more subtle happening in perception of difficulty. Tasks that were once neutral begin to feel heavier than they objectively are. Not because they changed, but because internal resistance to initiation has increased. And when resistance increases, everything feels like effort before it even begins. This creates a distortion. Life feels harder, even if external conditions remain unchanged. And that perceived hardness reinforces avoidance. Because the brain always prefers what feels easier, not what is objectively easier. So perception drives behavior more than reality. At this point, many people begin to identify themselves through limitation language. I'm not consistent. I don't have discipline. I struggle with focus. These statements feel descriptive, but they are actually reinforcing identity boundaries. And identity boundaries determine what feels possible to sustain. Because what you believe you are becomes the range of effort you are willing to maintain. There is also a deeper emotional layer that develops quietly. Reduced self-respect in private moments. Not dramatic self-criticism, just subtle internal lowering of standards. A quiet acceptance of behavior that does not align with the person you claim to want to become. And that gap, repeated enough times, creates internal fragmentation. Because identity is not just thought. It is consistency between intention and action over time. When that consistency breaks repeatedly, the system adapts by lowering expectation instead of increasing alignment. This is how internal coherence weakens without visible collapse. Everything appears functional externally, but internally, alignment is no longer stable. Before continuing, consider this carefully. If your system has learned to repeatedly choose immediate relief over delayed effort, then the issue is not lack of awareness. It is reinforcement history, and reinforcement history shapes default response faster than insight can override it. That is why change at this level is not about understanding more. It is about interrupting pattern selection at the moment of choice. Not once, repeatedly, until the system begins to learn a different association between discomfort and response. Because right now, the association is simple. Discomfort right pointing arrow exit. But that association is not permanent. It is trained, and what is trained can be retrained. The next part will go into what happens when this pattern is left long enough to affect ambition directly, not just discipline. How goals begin to lose emotional charge, and why some men eventually stop believing in their own future direction even while still talking about it. That is where the shift becomes deeper. Not behavior anymore, but meaning itself. For now, the system continues doing what it has learned best. Reducing friction by reducing resistance. And slowly shaping what kind of effort feels worth repeating. At some point, something quieter happens than failure. You stop believing your own direction has weight. Not openly, not in words, internally. Goals still exist on paper. Plans still form in thought. Future versions of yourself are still imagined with clarity. But emotionally, they begin to feel less binding. Less like destinations. More like concepts you revisit when the mind needs structure again. This is the point where ambition begins to detach from behavior. And that separation changes everything. Because ambition is not just desire. It is emotional pressure toward execution. When that pressure weakens, intention becomes passive. And passive intention does not survive contact with resistance. So when difficulty appears, there is no longer internal force pushing through it. Only evaluation. Is this worth it right now? And in a system trained toward immediate relief, that question rarely favors effort. So execution becomes conditional. And conditional execution slowly erodes identity consistency. There is a specific psychological shift that happens here. You stop measuring yourself by what you do consistently, and start measuring yourself by what you can still imagine doing. Imagination replaces evidence, and imagination always feels cleaner than reality. This is where many people remain stuck for long periods without realizing the mechanism. They are no longer failing outwardly. They are rehearsing identity internally without anchoring it in action. So self-perception stays inflated relative to actual output. And that gap creates a quiet tension that is often ignored because it does not manifest as crisis. It manifests as delay. There is also a subtle change in emotional relationship to time. The present becomes easier to manage than the future. Not because the present is better, but because it requires no commitment beyond itself. So attention collapses into immediacy. And immediacy becomes the default state of decision-making. This is where long-term direction begins to lose influence over daily behavior. Not suddenly, gradually, through repeated prioritization of immediate emotional states. And when that happens enough times, the brain stops treating future identity as a guiding force. It becomes background narrative instead of active driver. At this stage, people often misinterpret their condition as confusion. But confusion is not the real issue. The real issue is competing reward systems where one consistently wins due to lower friction. So clarity does not solve it. Because clarity is not the limiting factor. Control of selection at the moment of discomfort is. There is another effect that develops quietly: reduced sensitivity to self-imposed consequences. When a person repeatedly breaks their own internal agreements without external consequence, the nervous system begins to treat those agreements as non-binding. And once internal agreements lose binding force, discipline becomes externally dependent. Meaning effort only holds under observation, deadlines, or pressure from others. Without that, structure dissolves. This is not a moral failure. It is a learned behavioral hierarchy. External structure over internal structure. And that hierarchy determines long-term autonomy. There is also a narrowing effect on ambition itself. Not in terms of desire, but in emotional intensity behind desire. You can still want large outcomes, but the emotional charge behind them weakens. They stop feeling urgent. They stop creating internal pressure to act. And without urgency, action becomes optional again. This creates a strange contradiction. The mind still thinks big, but the body operates small. And over time, that contradiction becomes normal. You begin to live in two parallel systems. One that imagines expansion, one that avoids friction, and neither fully overrides the other. So energy is divided, not evenly, but inconsistently. This is why consistency feels elusive even when motivation returns briefly. Because motivation does not replace structure. It temporarily overlays it, and overlays fade when reinforcement pulls the system back. There is a deeper consequence here that most only recognize indirectly. Confidence in execution begins to degrade. Not confidence in ideas, confidence in follow-through. And when follow-through confidence weakens, even starting becomes heavier. Because the mind anticipates incomplete cycles. So it resists initiation to avoid the emotional cost of abandonment. This creates a loop. Avoidance reduces execution. Reduced execution reduces confidence. Reduced confidence increases avoidance. And the loop tightens silently. At this stage, many people begin searching externally for solutions. New systems, new strategies, new bursts of motivation. But without addressing reinforcement behavior, none of these changes stabilize. Because the underlying system remains unchanged. There is also something important happening beneath awareness. The self-image begins to adjust to reduced output without resistance. Not as collapse, but as recalibration. You begin to expect less from yourself to avoid repeated disappointment. And that expectation shift is dangerous because it feels like acceptance. But it is actually contraction. A slow reduction of internal standards to match repeated behavior. And once standards contract enough, effort feels like exception rather than baseline. This is where identity drift becomes visible. Not in what you say about yourself, but in what you consistently tolerate from yourself. Now consider something carefully. If your ambition still feels intact in thought but inconsistent in execution, then the limiting factor is not vision. It is not intelligence. It is not even motivation. It is reinforcement dominance at the point of discomfort. And reinforcement dominance does not respond to awareness alone. It responds to interruption of pattern at the moment it tries to repeat. Repeated interruption. Not perfect interruption, just consistent disruption of automatic exit behavior. Because right now, the system has learned one rule very efficiently. Discomfort is a signal to disengage. And as long as that rule remains unchallenged, ambition will remain structurally weaker than impulse. There is a final shift that begins here before deeper transformation becomes possible. A realization that nothing external is actually required to change the pattern. Only resistance to the automatic sequence at the exact moment it initiates. Not before, not after, during. That is where control actually exists. And it is rarely where people look. Because it is uncomfortable, subtle, and unglamorous. But it is also the only point where the system is still flexible. Everything else is just consequence. The next part will go into what happens when this pattern is left unchecked long enough to reshape not just discipline or ambition, but how a man interprets himself entirely, how identity becomes stabilized around limitation, and why breaking out of that state feels like loss before it ever feels like progress. For now, the pattern continues operating in silence, choosing ease when resistance appears, and slowly defining what kind of future feels believable enough to pursue. There is a stage where nothing feels wrong anymore. That is usually interpreted as stability. But it can also be adaptation to limitation. The difference is subtle enough that most people never question it. Life continues. Function continues. Even progress exists in fragments. But something foundational has already shifted. The range of what you expect from yourself has quietly narrowed to match what you repeatedly do under no pressure. And once that happens, identity stops being aspirational. It becomes descriptive. You no longer say what you are becoming. You say what you typically manage. This is where transformation becomes difficult for most people, not because they lack knowledge, but because their internal baseline has already adjusted downward to reduce psychological tension. And the system always prefers reduced tension over expanded potential. That preference is not emotional. It is mechanical. It stabilizes behavior by minimizing internal conflict between intention and repetition. But stability built on limitation feels identical, at first, to stability built on mastery. So the wrong conclusion is often drawn. I'm fine like this, not because it is true in a deep sense, but because it is less mentally demanding than maintaining tension between who you are and who you know you could be. That tension is uncomfortable, but it is also where change lives. When that tension disappears completely, it is not because alignment has been achieved. It is because the gap has been closed in the wrong direction. Expectation adjusted downward to match behavior, instead of behavior rising to meet expectation. And once that adjustment is complete, effort no longer feels like growth. It feels like overextension. There is another effect that becomes clearer here. The loss of internal urgency. Not panic, not stress, urgency. The quiet pressure that once made certain decisions feel non-negotiable fades. And without that pressure, everything becomes negotiable. I could do it later. I might start tomorrow. It's not that important right now. Each sentence feels reasonable in isolation. But together, they form a system where nothing ever fully activates. This is how ambition dies in real life. Not through rejection. Through postponement that never gets corrected. And postponement, repeated enough times, reprograms self-trust. Because every unfulfilled internal commitment teaches the system the same lesson. Your intentions are optional. Once that lesson is learned, effort becomes unstable even when desire returns. Because desire no longer guarantees execution. And when desire loses authority, discipline must carry everything alone. But discipline without internal authority is fragile. It requires constant force instead of alignment. There is also a quieter consequence that most people only recognize much later. Time no longer feels like a resource being invested. It feels like something being spent without structure. Days pass with activity but without accumulation. Weeks pass with movement but without compounding identity change. And at some point, a question begins to surface in subtle form. Why am I not where I assumed I would be by now? That question rarely receives a direct answer. Because the answer is not a single event. It is repetition patterns that were never interrupted long enough to redirect trajectory. There is no dramatic failure point. Only accumulated choices that consistently favored low resistance. And low resistance always builds a predictable outcome over time. Now, here is where the critical shift becomes possible. Because understanding the pattern is no longer the issue. The issue is whether the moment of discomfort is still being interpreted as a signal to exit, or as a signal to stay present long enough to override automation. That single moment determines direction more than any long-term plan. Not intention over months, selection at seconds. And most people underestimate how much identity is shaped in those seconds. If every moment of friction has historically resulted in disengagement, then the system has been trained precisely. Disengage equals relief. Engage equals discomfort, and the brain will always choose what it has learned produces relief faster. So the work is not to fight the system broadly. It is to interrupt that exact equation repeatedly until it weakens. Discomfort does not mean exit. Discomfort means change is being attempted. That reframe alone is not enough. But it is the beginning of structural reversal. Because once discomfort stops automatically triggering escape, the system becomes open again to reconditioning. And reconditioning is where identity is rebuilt. Not through motivation spikes, not through emotional peaks, but through repeated exposure to effort without retreat. There is no dramatic ending to this pattern in real life. No single moment where everything resets. What exists instead is a gradual rebuilding of tolerance for friction, attention, and delayed reward. And as that tolerance increases, something else returns slowly. Self-trust. Not confidence in outcome, confidence in follow-through, and that is the only form of confidence that actually sustains discipline. Everything else is temporary emotional elevation. So if anything remains after understanding all of this, it is not urgency to feel different. It is recognition of where selection still happens automatically. Because that is the only place change is still available. Not in insight, in interruption. And interruption repeated long enough becomes a new default. At that point, the system no longer runs you. It responds to you. But getting there is not a single decision. It is a sequence of moments where discomfort no longer wins automatically. That is the entire structure beneath what most people call discipline. Now the question shifts completely. Not whether you understand it, but whether you will allow the same automatic escape to continue the next time it appears. Because nothing in your future changes at the level of thought. It changes at the level of what you stop repeating. And what you stop repeating begins in moments that feel insignificant at the time, but define everything that follows. Silent command. Do not replay this understanding as information only. Let it enter behavior. And if this message is continued, it will not be for insight again.